what is happening there, and also what can we do as a civil society, as an individuals, as an international community to support the movement in Kashmir, and also, of course, calling for the release of Khurram and also Irfan. Just a quick reminder that, yeah, 19 June is the birthday of Khurram, and this marked his 940 days in prison. And 3 days ago is also the birthday of Irfan Meraj, who's also in prison with Khurram. Before we start the conversation today, I would like to remind everyone that this conversation is also being live streamed in the YouTube of Forum Asia. And we also have the question box. So if you have any questions, you can drop your questions in the question box, and we will try to address it either in between the conversation or at the end. And lastly, of course, thanks to all the co-organizers who are supporting this event. We have AFAD, we have OMCT, FIDH, CIVICUS, Kashmir Law and Justice Project, Martin Ennals Foundation, and also Frontline Defenders. And we are joined with 3 distinguished speakers with us today. But before moving on to, and I will introduce all the speakers, I have a letter written by Prabir Purkayasta, the editor of NewsClick. He was imprisoned with Khurram together in Rohini jail, and he has kindly written a letter for all of us to remember his interaction with Khurram while he was in prison together in Rohini jail. So I will read it out, and after that we will move on to our conversation. It is my privilege to write about Khurram Parvez, who is currently in Rohini jail under various provisions of the draconian UAPA. I had heard about him before from my colleagues, as NewsClick had a small Srinagar office. But we met only when I was arrested and taken to Rohini jail. It confirmed what I had heard about him. He is a person deeply committed to civil liberties and democratic values. Not surprisingly, there is an attempt to silence him, like many others, not for what he has done, but what he stands for, the right of democratic dissent. That he and many others are in prison is a commentary on the turn our Indian democracy has now taken. I'm not going to dwell on Khurram's work on civil liberties, or how and why he chose to focus on civil rights in Kashmir. Others who have known him longer will do that much better than me. I am, instead, going to speak about the man I met in Rohini, about how I saw him deal with multiple problems. I want to talk about him as a person, a prisoner, a civil rights activist, and also as a practicing Muslim. As a person, he is one of the kindest men I have met. Any prisoner could walk up to him and seek his help with all kinds of problems. Whether the problem was with the prison authorities, or a legal situation, or even with the family. Khurram met any of these problems, however trivial they seem, with a smile, advice, and quite often an appropriate application. While everyone in jail who can write English helps with applications, Khurram's advantage, or perhaps a disadvantage in jail, is that he also knows a fair amount of law from his work with civil liberties. So all of us tended to take the easy cop-out of suggesting him to help. At the worst, Khurram will ask them to meet him later to draft their applications. I hardly ever heard him saying no. He draws respect from all, from fellow prisoners, from the jail staff, and even from the less secular-minded, who hold a jaundiced view of other communities. Khurram, the Kashmiri journalist and civil rights activist Irfan Meraj, and I decided that we should share our knowledge with each other so that our time in jail will be put to some use. In spite of all the disturbances, such as arbitrary lockdowns or people demanding instant applications from Khurram, we managed to cover a fair chunk of history. I will talk about adding geography and technology to our larger understanding of history. This was also to deepen our views of the development of European colonial empires that had shaped the modern world. Khurram and Irfan will educate me on Arab and Persian history, as both histories are closely linked with the rise of Islam. our love for history become a common point, a bond. We gain from what each of us knew. We also develop a better sense on how to look at history itself. Obviously, after spending 7.5 months in Rohini jail, I'm delighted to be out, even if the case against me continues. But I do feel a deep sense of sorrow that people like Khurram and Irfan continue to be in prison. They can contribute so much more to building the inclusive society all of us dream about. And I do miss my discussions with them. Their passion for knowledge, driven by the sense of humor and humanity they have held onto even in these dark times. So that's the letter from Prabir to start our conversation today. And I will move on to our first speaker, Mona. Mona Ban is a professor of anthropology and the Fort Maxwell Professor of South Asian Studies at Syracuse University. She is a political and environmental anthropologist whose work on Indian-occupied Kashmir explores the role of economic and infrastructural development in counterinsurgency operations and people's resistance movement to protracted wars and settler occupation. She is the author of Counterinsurgency, Development and the Politics of Identity, From Warfare to Welfare, and Climate Without Nature, a critical anthropology of the Anthropocene. With her colleagues from the Critical Kashmir Studies Collective that she helped to co-found in 2013, she has co-edited Resisting Occupation in Kashmir, the Routledge Handbook of Critical Kashmir Studies, and the Palgrave Handbook of New Direction in Kashmir Studies. Her writings and interviews have appeared in several media and print outlets such as BBC, Al Jazeera, TRT, Kindle, Open Democracy, and also Outlook. So thanks for joining us today, Mona. So my first question to you, we have heard about who is Khurram in prison and how kind and passionate he is, even though with all the hardship that he is facing. So if you can tell us a little bit more on who is Khurram and what has been the essence of his activism.
Thank you so much, Benny, and thank you to everyone who's here and has put in the effort to organize this to honor Khurram's work thus far, to honor JKCCS's work, to not forget what these amazing individuals have done for Kashmir and for humanity more broadly. I thought Prabir's introduction, or his letter, was just such an intimate, deeply felt account of Khurram and what his essence is. I thought he captured it so brilliantly. I'm just going to try to do some sort of brief clinical introduction for people who don't know Khurram at all. So Khurram, an internationally renowned human rights defender, has been in judicial custody since November 2021 under the recently, not that recent anymore, the amended UAPA, the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act. It's an anti-terror law that gives the Indian government broad discretionary powers to designate individuals as terrorists and criminalize activities that are crucial for upholding people's civil liberties, their rights, and their freedoms. Over the past 2 decades, Khurram has worked as a program coordinator and spokesperson for the JKCCS, the only credible human rights organization that was allowed to work for a few decades in Kashmir before it was completely clamped down. And by the way, tomorrow marks the 24th year of JKCCS's formation. So it's Irfan's birthday, it's Khurram's birthday, and it is JKCCS's birthday as well that we must mark. So what JKCCS has done under Khurram's leadership is documented an array of India's repressive laws and mechanisms that have been designed to silence Kashmiri voices. In 2021, he was unanimously re-elected as the chairperson of Asian Federation Against Involuntary Disappearances, AFAD, and this was from prison, which is quite telling. And that was a position he'd held since 2014. In April, Khurram was unanimously elected the Deputy Secretary General of the International Federation for Human Rights, FIDH, for his path-breaking, brave, and commendable work in the field of human rights. He's gotten multiple accolades. The Reebok Human Rights Award in 2006, for example. He made it to the Times list, the top 100 most influential people in 2022. In 2023, he received the Martin Ennals Human Rights Defender Award, which recognized basically his outstanding role in pioneering the work of human rights in Kashmir and to bring the voice of the voiceless, is how they framed it, to the international arena, despite the ongoing, sometimes life-threatening challenges that human rights frontline defenders experience. I want to situate Khurram's work in relation to what's happening broadly with these anti-terror laws. So in November 2021, Ajit Doval, the National Security Advisor to the Modi government, who was recently reappointed as the National Security Advisor, declared that civil society was now the new frontier of war. And that has established a deeply troubling precedent in India. By criminalizing civil society actions and their mandate, such declarations have undermined any kind of credible space that can commit itself to principles of social and political justice, have criminalized funding coming from international organizations, and that's precisely what they're trying to, get Khurram for. And this law has been criticized for its sweeping powers to charge individuals as terrorists and also undermine institutional mechanisms for juridical redressal. People have argued how this law, the UAPA, violates international covenant on civil and political rights by reneging on the principle of innocent until proven guilty and the provision of anticipatory bail, prompt, timely, and just trials. The process is the punishment, as we've repeatedly heard. And in Khurram's case, it couldn't be clearer how, because if you look at the two cases that have been filed against him thus far, for one of the cases from 2021, there are 171 witnesses, for example, and that's amounted to 8,000 pages of charge sheet. For the other case from 2020, there's around 188 witnesses amounting to 5,000 pages of the charge sheet. And a lot of these witnesses are quote unquote protected. But what also has happened that the incriminatory material accompanying these charge sheets has either not been provided to the lawyers or has been provided incrementally, piecemeal basis, which is obviously delaying the process considerably. And generally speaking, habeas corpus petitions are not even entertained by the High Court anymore. They just do not, they dismiss them right off the bat. They don't want to entertain them. There's thousands of people languishing in jails. We don't even have a number anymore, precisely because of the kind of silencing that has happened on any kind of human rights work in the region, or just plain freedom of expression. There's none. So we have no credible data anymore. There were a number of young people, young men who were picked during this election cycle, for example, and then they just keep them in detention, release them in 5 or 10 days. But that's how the process goes. No one knows what's actually happening. It has become this sort of a black hole of an information without the credible work that Khurram did or the CCS did. Khurram's journey actually started as a 13-year-old. Some of us here might know that already. He was a young kid, and he saw his grandfather gunned down in a protest, a very pivotal moment for him that he defines as one of those moments that defined his life's mission for him. And he decided voluntarily to take on human rights and work for the collective peace, dignity, and liberation of his people. And of course, such work comes at a tremendous personal cost. And in Khurram's case, I mean, we've seen what the cost has been. But even prior to that, in 2004, way back, when he was on election duty, he lost a leg because of a mine blast. He lost 2 of his very close colleagues from JKCCS in that same event. He was in custody in 2016 for 76 days when he was stopped from going to Geneva to attend the Human Rights Council meetings. And this generally the kind of harassment to his family, the deep wound that this incarceration has created for the communities that really cared for him, that he cared for so deeply, is something I just can't put in words. But one thing I do want to say is that that Khurram is not simply a Kashmiri activist. He is a global advocate for rights of people, and I'm sure we'll hear it from our other speakers too. And his along with his colleagues like Irfan Miraj, the young journalist, and his close aide, who's also in prison, they've done the important work of documenting the everyday ways, the institutionalized ways in which people's rights have been snatched by these draconian laws, by this repressive apparatus of the state. And we have been reminded by Mary Lalore, human rights defenders are not terrorists, and we need to heed to that. We need to take that very seriously. We need to remind the Indian government that they cannot keep doing this. They cannot keep incarcerating frontline defenders who seek the collective liberation for everyone. And one thing I want to add here, I've seen Khurram on multiple occasions invest his time, his effort, his energy to work, to think across differences, to bridge ideological divisions, to bridge, to bring his astute observations to resolve complex issues, teach and encourage young scholars, young human rights activists to become a better version of themselves every minute of the day. I've seen him tirelessly do that kind of work. So I'm not surprised when you read out Prabir's letter. That's exactly what he's doing in jail too. He's just spreading his light, his life, his zest for life, and doing it in such dignified, marvelous ways. Just to kind of close it, the work he's done, the work CCS has done over the years, it is the work of not just being archivists, but also translators. And they have single-handedly, as this wonderful organization, done the incredible work of translating international law into categories, into frameworks that resonate with the context in Kashmir, and figured out a way to think about Kashmir within the context of international law, within the context of human rights. I remember this very early meeting with Khurram, where his emphasis on rights frameworks was something that really, kept his mission alive and going. So yeah, I mean, I have way more to add to Khurram as a person and what he brings to the table, and how terribly tragic it is that we don't have his astute mind to give us directions at this very dark hour. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mona. I think you did great introduction, and I personally also feel closer to Khurram now, like based on your stories and explanation. And with that, I want to move on to our next two speakers. First, we have Joey Faustino from AFAD. Joey is the brother of a disappeared. His brother, Gary, a student activist, was disappeared along with 9 other individuals during the martial rule time in the Philippines. And even at a young age, Joey with his family had to contend with cases of enforced disappearances of the 10 individuals. And picking up from his father, Joey joined FIND, the Families of Victims of Involuntary Disappearance in the Philippines. And with this organization, FIND, he served as a member, officer, and later Secretary General, as he joined the victims' families in their common struggle for truth and justice. And concurrently, Joey went into development work in the coconut sector and alternative legal services for the marginalized sector with other civil society organizations in the Philippines. And now Joey is the Secretary General of the Asian Federation Against Involuntary Disappearances, or AFAD, and operating in the 10 countries in Asia. AFAD works towards the attainment of truth, justice, redress, and reconstruction of the historical memory of the disappeared. So Joey, my question to you, as Mona already mentioned a bit, that Khurram has also a very strong connection with AFAD. So if you can tell us a bit more about the work of AFAD and how Khurram's role is essential in the movement against enforced disappearance in Kashmir and also in the region, because we understood that Khurram's work, the impact is like goes beyond Kashmir only. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Benny, and good evening from the AFAD Federation headquarters. Yes, I'd like to confirm some of Mona did quite a lot of what Khurram had done, but I'd like to confirm that yes, exactly. In 2021, during the 7th Congress of AFAD, Khurram was already detained at the time, but still, the member organizations of the federation had to declare Khurram still the chairperson for the federation. This is basically the respect that Khurram has attained. It was his third term at that time. And AFAD held on. We did not want to leave Khurram. We wanted to stay by his side, but specifically because of what he had done. You see, friends, enforced disappearances is quite a more difficult human rights violation case to deal with. Most of the global population would not be so attuned to the real essence of enforced disappearance. To us, like me, a brother of a desaparecido, well, apart from the fact that you lose your kin, your relative, you're part of the victim. You've been victimized as well, and probably the torture that they had experienced is a lifetime torture for the families, especially mostly women, who will have to survive and cope with this disappearance. And Khurram actually had this great responsibility to make it known. AFAD as a federation was very much instrumental in the International Convention for the Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearance. And so working after the entry into force of this convention in 2010, this is where AFAD, and especially under the leadership of Khurram, would have worked on to, one, ratify, accede to the International Convention, develop laws according to the International Convention. And this is a very hard task to deal with. And Khurram started most of the direction towards this. I remember he wanted AFAD, an Asian federation, to somehow converge in ideas with FEDIFAM, because Latin America, FEDIFAM is the organization of the disappeared in Latin America. So he wanted that Asia would not have to experience as much years in a long period to deal with enforced disappearance. And this is a very tough act to follow. It is still continuing at this point in so many countries in Asia. But what makes Khurram's experience now with the anti-torture law of India, the UAPA, is that this is it's very significant to us because this is becoming a trend in the whole of Asia. So now you see a lot of countries where supposedly criminal laws are used against the activists. The likes of Khurram and journalists and even lawyers of the activists their weapons laws are being weaponized now to stifle dissent and criticism. And it hits us right smack at the way we want to develop our work and simply live in a world without disappearances. I'll say as far as that, as of this moment, for Khurram. The only thing I have to add probably to Mona, I'm not sure if she mentioned a great work of JKCCS and the APDP, the Association of Disappeared Persons, is the discovery of the mass graves and the documentation. You see, this is where we work most, documentation of the cases of enforced disappearances. And now without Khurram, we're sorely missing the cases in Kashmir. We've developed a database, Disappeared Asia. So this database will now contain all of the cases that we have documented in the 10 countries so far, but we still want to expand that. And we're sorely missing now the cases of APDP in Kashmir. We couldn't even work with any other organization in Kashmir as far as the information that we have. There is no civil society organization operating in the area. So the fight of Khurram is not only his own, but it reflects a whole lot in Kashmir and in the region of Asia. I leave it to that at this point, Benny. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Joey. And maybe after this, we can also go deeper into like the situation in Kashmir as well. With that, I will introduce our next panelist, Juliet. Juliet is the Deputy Director for Asia at the International Federation for Human Rights, or FIDH. He has been leading the organization's work on South Asia for over 6 years, alongside with the FIDH member organizations in the region. Her background includes work on a wide range of human rights issues in Asia, working with local, regional, and international civil society organizations. She also worked as a freelance journalist based in Nepal. She has Bachelor of Arts in International Relations and Communication from the University of Southern California, and also Master of Arts in International Affairs from the George Washington University. So Juliet, my question to you, as FIDH is, I understood, is one of the oldest human rights network, or maybe the oldest network in the world. And Khurram is also at the moment the Deputy Secretary General there. If you can tell us a bit more about Khurram's role in FIDH and also like global human rights movement in general. So yeah, over to you, Juliet.
Thank you, Benny, and thank you to Forum Asia also for taking the lead in organizing this webinar, which I think is a very, very needed event to bring more awareness of Khurram's detention and hopefully see some positive results. You know, as you mentioned, FIDH is one of the oldest human rights organizations in the world, and really what we strive to do is work with our partner organizations to raise awareness about the different human rights situations and bring their voice to a bigger audience. Our member organizations are really the beating heart of FIDH, and of course, Khurram has been part of that family for a number of years. Officially, APDP joined FIDH at our Congress in Taiwan in 2019, and that started our work together in 2023. As has been mentioned, he was elected Deputy Secretary General by our international board, really as a testament to his activism, to his struggle, and also recognizing the impact that his detention is having on human rights in Kashmir, and recognizing the situation for what it is, which is in itself a violation of Khurram's human rights. You know, I first met Khurram in person for the first time in 2018 when he was in Paris for a forum on human rights defenders. And for me, what was particularly striking about him was his, determination to be part of this broader human rights movement. And I think this has been said by Mona, it's been said by Joey, but for me, Khurram is really someone who sees the human rights struggle as not necessarily being defined by geographical or political boundaries, but that's something that transcends those boundaries and impacts all of humanity. And I think that's really been a really big part of the work, is that violations in Kashmir are not just violations that impact Kashmiris, but that have an impact on broader humanity. And I think this explains his involvement in AFAD, working on the issue of enforced disappearances on a regional basis, his desire to be part and involved in FIDH and in the international component of the work. And also, and I think this has been said, but it bears repeating, but his determination to speak about the violations in Kashmir in an international human rights legal framework. And I think that's been very, very important in a context where domestic laws are being used and abused to violate for human rights. And I think that the work that JKCCS, that APDP, and that Khurram himself have done to talk about the situation, to talk about the violations, using international law, using international human rights standard as a framework, has been incredibly beneficial. I'll leave it at that. I think we'll have maybe an opportunity to talk more about the impact on human rights itself and what it means in the broader context.
Okay, thank you so much, Julia. I think so far we have heard Khurram as a person, as a activist working at the regional level and also like international level. So in the next part of the conversation, maybe we can go a bit deeper about the situation in Kashmir and like the challenges that the civil society and human rights defenders are facing there. I first would like to quote what Mona first you mentioned, that in this kind of situation, the process is the punishment. And we also see like a few days ago, the government revived the old case against Arundhati Roy over her commentary back in 2010. And then they try to revive this kind of case. So in your observation and analysis, like what is the prevailing human rights situation in Kashmir and the underlying challenges, like how we are in this situation at the moment? And if you can add any historical context for us who are not really well aware about the historical context. So yeah, over to you.
Thanks, Benny. So I think a reminder here, of course, is that Khurram's case is not, it's not an exceptional case. It's a case that teaches us a lot about the law, about how UAPA is being used in a systemic, concerted, and purposeful way to delegitimize a civil society. Of course, Arundhati Roy's case in point, Dr. Shaukat Hussain, the other co-accused in that case, his name, and he's, of course, as a Kashmiri Muslim, under way more, the scanner is larger for him, and the consequences might be worse. Let's hope not. In any case, the point is that Khurram, time and again, has reminded us to not just speak about him, right? He's often stressed the importance of recognizing the institutionalized ways in which UAPA is targeting civil society in Kashmir, and clearly in other, such draconian laws becoming part of countries outside of India, as we just heard. And I think what we need to recognize is, so it's not just the detention, right? It's also how people are detained, where they're detained, the financial implications of detention for Kashmiris, for example, who are not lodged in jails in Kashmir, but spread across the country, particularly in this, in this just insane heat in Delhi, for example. I mean, they're just like little things that we do need to keep in mind as we think about UAPA and how it impacts the mind, the body, the collective psyche of Kashmiris. But at the same time, we have to recognize that the UAPA's implications for Kashmiris are compounded by a range of pre-existing legal, political, military, and juridical instruments that, for example, include the AFSPA, a law that was imposed in the 1990s and affords the military complete impunity against a range of violent acts and acts of terror that they commit against civilians. Kashmir is the most militarized region in the world, and that's led just by default because of how intensely militarized it is. It's led to a range of human rights violations over time. It has literally, just snatched people's rights to life and sometimes to death even. An estimated 1,081 Kashmiri civilians, for example, were killed by the Indian military in extrajudicial executions from 2008 to 2018, just a matter of 10 years. And from 2018 onwards, we don't even have those figures given the context we just described. In fact, from 1989 onwards, at least 8,000 people or more have been disappeared, and that goes back to the incredible work CCS did with their report in 2009 entitled "Buried Evidence," which basically exposes the existence of unknown and unmarked mass graves in multiple districts in the Kashmir region. They found around 3,000 bodies or more in 2,700 graves. And at the same time, the Jammu and Kashmir Public Safety Act from the 1970s has legalized preventive detention. So there's this sort of draconian lawfare of the Indian government that has been going on for a long, long time, right? And the UAPA is just a recent manifestation of this deep, dark history. And CCS and Khurram have repeatedly emphasized this larger culture of institutionalized violence and impunity in Kashmir. And that's the key to remember, that it's institutionalized, it's structural, it's systemic. Apart from these military and legal infrastructures, there's a series of uninterrupted lockdowns, for example, that Kashmiris have experienced over time, but particularly after 2019 with the abrogation of Articles 370 and 35A. And at this time, Kashmiris had no access to the media, to phone services, or to the internet. A lot of activist advocacy groups called it a case of digital apartheid. And one of the countries where the internet was shut down the most was India. It was 109 times in the year 2020, and out of those 109 times, 90% of it was in Kashmir. So that just gives you a sense of, the kind of digital repression. But even after the internet was restored, what's happened now over the last 5-7 years is the complete sort of criminalization of any expression on social media. In 2022, Twitter complied with the government's orders, and it geo-blocked scores of accounts that were critical of India's policies in Kashmir. And not all of these accounts operated from India. That's the other thing. It's something we probably need to be mindful of, is how UAPA wants to extend its tentacles beyond the borders in India and to round up people who are not necessarily in India at the moment. Apart from this, I think what we have to keep in mind is that the current situation, despite the government's attempts to present this picture of normalcy in Kashmir. And that's something they've really been investing a lot of resources on, is to promote this facade of normalcy in Kashmir, especially because the abrogation of 370 and 35A were meant to usher in, quote unquote, a new dawn for Kashmir and to, help Kashmir become developed and catch up with the rest of India, so on and so forth. So that was the rhetoric. And yet what you see, especially according to this Human Rights Watch report from 2022, the report discusses how police interrogations, raids, and threats and physical assaults, restrictions on freedom and movement, and trumped up charges of terror charges against people has increased manifold. That has intensified. So on the one hand, you have this picture of picture perfect idea of normalcy, and on the other hand, you have the intensification of these draconian laws, which, by the way, go completely unreported, and nobody even talks about them because there's nobody to talk about. I'll talk about this later, perhaps. There's a complete media shutdown in Kashmir. I mean, newspapers that could perhaps speak against the government have completely been silenced, and you see a very different narrative emerge from those media circuits. So there is no way to know what's really going on. Having said that, and something we need to be mindful of is, I don't know if you know this, but a right-wing commentator, Anand Ranganathan, recently called for an Israel-like solution to the Kashmir problem. So that's really just extremely worrisome. And this is, of course, not new. This has happened before, too, in 2019, where some, right-wing ideologues called for this kind of a solution for Kashmir. But I want us to understand, where does that desire to eliminate the Kashmiri Muslim from the body politic of Kashmir even come from? And part of it is the imaginary of Kashmir as a font of Hindu civilization, according to the BJP, according to the RSS, outfits. The idea that we need to reclaim Kashmir as this sort of primordial birthplace of Hinduism, and therefore, how that can happen is by eliminating the Kashmiri Muslim. So I think we need to be very mindful of these. Might seem like fringe opinions, but these are clearly not fringe opinions anymore. This Israel-like solution is not a fringe opinion. I feel it is sort of integral to this imaginary of Kashmir within the Indian subcontinent. And there are material changes that have happened, whether it's in the kinds of laws that have been passed in the region since 2019, the abrogation, for example, the granting of domicile certificates to non-Kashmiris that allows them to buy land in the region, that allows them to participate in elections, that allows them to access educational benefits, vote for elections, et cetera, et cetera. That's opened the floodgates for this kind of a demographic shift that is at the core of this imaginary of Kashmir as a Hindu homeland. At the same time, land laws have been changed dramatically. Large land holdings, there was big land holdings were not possible according to local Kashmir laws, but that's now been they've just been thrown out of the window, essentially, and it has allowed corporate takeover of very critical strategic land. There's land that the military can deem strategic very easily now and forcibly claim it as their own. So there is all this stuff. So it's not just an imaginary. What I'm trying to say, this idea that, this is how we need to transform Kashmir, is no longer just an imagination. There are policies in place, there are laws in place that are materially transforming the landscape of Kashmir as we know it. Having said that, there's also lithium, for example, was recently discovered in Kashmir, which means that it's also been, of course, thrown open to extractive capitalism in ways that it will completely damage the landscape. There's mechanized riverbed mining that's going on, unregulated, without any environmental clearance. There's the use of hydropower that has been going on for a long time, where Kashmir's resources are used to power the Indian economy, and Kashmir is still kind of presented as this hapless, helpless, space. And so very kind of a colonial relationship that India has, or in a settler colonial relationship that India has established vis-a-vis Kashmir that we need to be mindful of. The last thing I want to talk about is the use of chemical warfare in Kashmir. We saw that, for example, with the use of white phosphorus recently in a place like Kulgam. But again, it was used prior to now in 2017 in Pulwama. So there are these things that are happening, again, that we have no documentation of, no comprehensive documentation of, precisely because our frontline defenders, such as Khurram and Irfan and others, countless others, and journalists and academics are in prison and cannot freely write about it, or cannot just even express themselves. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Mona. And with that, I want to move on to Juliet. Like Mona mentioned, like you have the institutionalized attacks against civil society, civic spaces closing, media is being shut down, CSOs, room for movement is also being shut down, and the whole colonial relationship between how India colonized Kashmir. And Juliet, based on your assessment, what will be the broader implications, even more, with this, attack against Khurrams and Irfan, the closing of civil society in Kashmir, how it will impact the human rights situation in Kashmir and then in the region at large?
Yes, thank you, Benny. I think it's really not an exaggeration to say that Khurram's detention has had a tremendous impact for Kashmiri civil society, and in some sense has kind of been a death knell for that civic space. What it's done really, and Mona's talked about this, the process being the punishment, but it's also really sent the message that no one is safe, because if Khurram can end up behind bars, then so can everyone else. If someone who has this level of, international fame, maybe a bit not the right word, but this kind of prominence internationally can be targeted in this way. Your second-rung human rights defenders, those who aren't so well known, can also very easily face the same consequences, and it really shows the extent to which the Indian government is willing to go with the repressive tactics. And what we're really seeing in Kashmir, in India, in Khurram's case, is an instrumentalization of conflict, of anti-terrorism discourse to go after human rights defenders, to go after the media. We've really seen this drastic increase in the use of the UAPA over the past decades to go after HRDs, human rights defenders. And we see here the extent to which the Indian judiciary has failed to put checks on the government. It's the judiciary should have been the ones to put to check the government on these repressive tactics, but instead it's increasingly showing signs of capitulation to the ruling party, to Hindutva ideological currents, and that's something that's very scary for Kashmir, for India, and for the region, because unfortunately what we see is countries tend to copy each other when it comes to repressing civic space, repressing speech. They see what works in one country and they decide to do the same, unfortunately. Also, one thing that I wanted to highlight is what we've seen throughout history is often that Kashmir has been a testing ground for repressive tactics by the Indian government. So tactics are tested in Kashmir. Once they're proven to be effective, they're exported to other parts of India. This goes for the repression of civic space. And so in that sense, Khurram's case is very much something that will have a broader impact. So again, not only on Kashmiri civic space, which we're already seeing, but also for regions of India, which on the surface have no direct connection to Kashmir. One other thing I wanted to highlight is we're always reminded here in Europe and probably other places in the world that India is the world's biggest democracy. It's something that's said over and over again. It's copied and pasted without really any thought going behind what that actually means. But democracy is really not just about being able to cast a vote on election day. Of course, that's a big part of it, but it's far from being the only part of it. I may be preaching to the choir here, but it's also about being able to freely express oneself, to access a wide range of opinions, diverse opinions, and to challenge the dominant narratives and to be able to weigh alternate narratives and decide for oneself. And what we're seeing here with the criminalization of Kashmiri civil society and essentially the criminalization of all speech related to Kashmir is the state forbidding the challenge of alternate narratives. We're seeing this, of course, extremely clearly with this case. We've already mentioned it here against Arundhati Roy and Sheikh Shaukat. Again, a case under, drumroll, the UAPA. And I think here it bears repeating, the UAPA is an anti-terrorism law. It's supposed to fight terrorism. I think the government may have a hard time, convincing the world that Arundhati Roy is a terrorist. But as Mona was saying, the process is the punishment. What this is a prime example of is criminalization of dissenting voices. If you disagree with the BJP's narrative on Kashmir, you face consequences. There is no alternative narrative that is allowed to
I think Juliet got disconnected a little bit, but while waiting for her to return, I think like she rightly pointed out all the challenges that is just continue to get more and more challenging. But then before going back to Juliet, maybe I can move on to Joey quickly on from your perspective working with JKCCS and also APDP. They are the only one working to document the enforced disappearances, the human rights violations that are taking place in Kashmir, and now even the work to memorialize these memories, these violations that is happening, it's also being criminalized. So what is the impact? What does it mean actually, to the whole movement who just they are not even trying to, freedom of expression, people getting arrested, of course, but then at the same time, even just documenting it, you are get labeled as a terrorist as well. So from AFAD's perspective, what does this mean? And Juliet, welcome back. We'll get back to you a little bit after this, after Joey.
Yeah,
thank you.
Sorry about that.
Yes, I'll share a little first, Juliet, with your permission. Benny, imagine a democratic nation, underscore democratic, where human rights violations are not allowed to be reported. This is exactly what you have right now. We've been going back to repressive laws, draconian laws. The UAPA, for example, would allow government to detain someone for 180 days. God, that's 6 months without charges. And talk about human rights. If the law itself is that oppressive, and you have a regime that is equally oppressive, authoritarian, then they have, quote unquote, maybe the right solution. But history of the world would also prove that authoritarianism, oppression, there will always be someone who would stand up to this, such as Khurram. And we all need to stand with Khurram in this kind of a situation. As I said, we're maybe looking at Kashmir right now, but the ripples extend far through the regional level, through Asia. We're trying to schedule a research study now on laws that are being used to oppress. We have it in Indonesia, we have it in Bangladesh, in Pakistan. It's all over Asia. You have anti-terrorism laws, you have anti-money laundering laws, you have libel and cyber libel. All of these laws are being used just to stifle criticism against government and exposing human rights violations. It's all over the place. So what we should do is really not take a silent attitude on cases such as Khurram's case and the others in the other Asian countries. The more repression we have, the more oppression there is. We need to stand up more and reach out to each other at the regional and international level, maybe with the United Nations as well. Let's stand up to this. Kashmir is one area. I mean, yes, I agree. Khurram would view it this way. It's not just Khurram. It's not just Kashmir. It's the people of the world. It's Asia with AFAD. AFAD would have its own contributions to this. And human rights is a very special aspect, even in the case of AFAD, where we usually document enforced disappearance cases. Why? Because enforced disappearance also start with human rights violations, abduction, illegal arrest, torture, etc., before they are finally disappeared. So it's really one basket that we all need to stand up for. And it's basically human rights. I'm not glad, of course, that Khurram is incarcerated, but I'm glad to be with this kind of a person who would stand up and fight for human rights, not limited to his own people, but to the others as well. So back to the point, imagine a democratic government who will not allow human rights violations to be reported, crippling civil society. So what do you expect? More human rights violations, more enforced disappearance, more impunity. And this is very dangerous. Let's all stand up against this. Thanks, Benny.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Joey. And Juliet, maybe going back to you a little bit. And then there's like some questions also in the Q&A box. So if the speakers would like to respond directly there, that's fine. But I think the first question is kind of like related to the FIDH work on like international advocacy quite a lot. Whether like, does the international system even work? Because there has been like a lot of calls on Khurram's release, reprisals, anti-reprisals campaign. And are human rights real in a practical sense, or is the international system actually pro-repression? Because we have seen how, you know, like the human rights champion countries are also perpetrators at the same time. And yeah.
Yeah, perhaps, I mean, just, you know, what I was in the process of saying before I got ominously put it off the Zoom, disconnected from the Zoom call. You know, that what this really shows, I mean, Khurram, again, may not have been as you know, may not have the same type of international platform than some others, but he did have a platform, and he did challenge the narrative. And so what really this is showing us is that what the government is telling us quite clearly with these cases is that documenting human rights violations is considered a way of form of challenging the narrative, that pointing out that violations are happening is secessionist, that it's seditious, that it's anti-national. All these terms, which by the way are now being used so broadly and against so many different people in India that I think they've lost all all sort of meaning, but I digress. And then this leads me to know your question and to some of what's been asked in the Q&A is, of course, the real danger is letting the authorities, letting the governments, letting Modi get away with it, and not having to face kind of criticism for these actions, getting away with incarcerating human rights defenders in blatant violation of India's international legal obligation. In a few weeks, India is going to be reviewed by the UN Human Rights Committee in Geneva on its obligations under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. It's been a number of years since they've been reviewed, and I think lots of NGOs have submitted reports. We're quite hopeful that the committee will echo those concerns and will have a damning review of India's respect of its commitments under the ICCPR. There's a lot more that needs to be done and that can be done when it comes to calling out the repressive tactics of the Indian government, to calling out what is happening in Kashmir. There's a lot that can be done because so very little is being done and so very little is being said by countries who are supposed to be on our side when it comes to human rights. India is being seen as this crucial geopolitical partner in Asia, and as a result, so many countries are afraid to call out the government, to call out the BJP on its human rights record, and that's extremely dangerous because what we've seen over the past decade is continually pushing the line as to what is possible. Now, of course, some may see the result of the election as a sign that maybe things have gone a little bit too far, and I think we're hopeful that maybe it would rein in some of the violations. But as we've seen again with the case against Arundhati Roy, I think we need to wait and see if it's actually going to have an impact. I think there needs to be a bigger solidarity movement internationally with Kashmiri human rights defenders, with Kashmiri civil society, to keep bringing their voices to the table and making sure that their voices are being heard despite this, this kind of complete lockdown or repression of civic space. And I think, that needs to be accompanied by more visible and bigger government reactions to what is happening in India. Because one thing that is for sure is that quietly criticizing India behind closed doors is not working as a policy. It's just not working because they've been doing that for years, and the situation just keeps getting worse.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Julian. And I think there's also like few questions, and maybe if I can direct this to Mona as well, like why this silence? Like we have not hear more from like the international media. There's less and less spotlight about what is happening in Kashmir, and even some comment also on like civil society organizations in India can be silent about it. This is all the effect of the systematic repressions that is happening, but at the same time, why international media is covering India less and less as well?
I mean, that's a great question. I was about to come to that anyway, so I'm glad that was raised as a question. I think the first thing, let me address the domestic, the Indian civil society and media. Yes, to an extent, it's true that the repressive apparatus is so much stronger now that it's become much harder for people to express themselves. Although, you see in the last 5 years, I feel alternative media in India has sort of come up in a substantial way to impact, for example, the recently concluded elections and the results that we have. So of course there is there's fear, there's deep fear among civil society groups in India, but there's also some form of a resurgence. And yet, having said that, you will not see those civil society organizations or certain media organizations, alternative media even, touch Kashmir with even a 100-foot pole, if I might say. And that's the problem, right? So you see, for example, and I'm glad for the amount of attention or the kind of attention, for example, on the Bhima Koregaon detainees, and they deserved every bit of it, absolutely. But you will not see, unfortunately, the same attention on someone like Khurram or Irfan or other Kashmiri journalists and advocates who've been in prisons, or other common Kashmiris who've been in prison for so long. And that's precisely the problem, the silencing of Kashmir. I mean, anything that happens in India, insofar as its democracy is concerned, is happening without any consideration for what's happening in Kashmir. That was always the case, even prior to the BJP, even before the BJP came to power. India's democracy was vibrant only because nobody talked about Kashmir. It was the largest democracy, it's largest in just terms of the number of people, but its vibrancy was often celebrated only because Kashmir was erased. Its judiciary was celebrated only because nobody really discussed how the Supreme Court, for example, had always had a very different approach towards Kashmir and Kashmir-related issues. So Kashmir is this sort of, it's the core, right? It is the original sin, if you will, of Indian might, Indian fascism, and yet nobody talks about Kashmir, right? So that's the problem, and that's why there's all the more reason for international organizations, for international advocacy efforts to really take on that burden that the Indian civil society refuses to take. It's very, very, very rare that Indian media, alternatively, forget the mainstream. I mean, the mainstream will obviously keep whipping Kashmir up and celebrating the Indian triumphalism in Kashmir. That's obviously the narrative. That's always been the case. And now we see it even with more vengeance in mainstream channels. But I'm talking about alternative Indian media that does not ever really talk about Kashmir in ways that it should, very sparingly, very sparingly. And Khurram's case is not at all being talked about in the Indian context. I mean, we have, for example, even someone like Umar Khalid, who absolutely must be talked about endlessly, but at least that's happening in many quarters. But Khurram's name, you will not see that. There's a complete erasure, as if we don't exist, as if they're not humans, as if they almost deserve this treatment that they're being given. So I think there's this something we need to recognize. The need for international solidarity efforts is even more critical than ever before. And that's why we need to figure out how to build these international solidarity efforts and do multi-front campaigns to make sure that we put pressure on the Modi government, of course, to release political prisoners, but at the same time also build enough understanding around Kashmir and enough sort of policy intent around Kashmir that can finally resolve this issue. Having said that, I do want to mention one quick thing. I mean, for Khurram and for people like him who work in the field of human rights, I mean, those human rights are not limited necessarily to a very statist understanding of human rights. It's always been in the context of international law, right? It's always been in the context of this fundamental right of Kashmiris to self-determine their futures, their political futures. So I just want to make sure for something like that to then come through, we need international advocacy efforts. We need people to talk about Kashmir in the right frameworks, not necessarily as this sort of sad outcome of Indian fascism, but as in its own right as a nation that is deserving of the rights to determine their future or its future. So that's something I really want to kind of point out. The other question, yes, why it's not happening internationally fully is, of course, things that have already been raised. India is considered the largest democracy. And again, we're back to the Western media celebrating India's democracy yet again after the election results, without necessarily understanding what this might mean. And I don't want to discount what's happened in India this past month, but at the same time, we do need to take that with a grain of salt, because what happens is this language of democracy ends up silencing international criticism of India, and its relationship with Kashmir, its deeply colonial relationship with Kashmir. Nobody talks about it because it does not suit their economic, political interests. And that's what's unfortunately happening with states jockeying for favors from India, the US supporting India right now because, it's a common enemy in China that they see. So things like that are really kind of unfortunate. But the geopolitical calculus is such that, we do need to keep this in mind as we think through our advocacy efforts now and in the future. But at the same time, I'm also kind of, given what's happened with the Indian elections, is there ways we can push the UN, for example, to write actively to MPs who might be slightly sympathetic to Kashmir? I know there's at least one that comes to mind who said something against the abrogation of Article 370. He was an IAS officer from Kerala who's actually, I think, in the parliament now. So I think trying to figure out, what are the leverages we might have, given that these odds are stacked up against us. We still might have some leverages that we need to use to get our points across. That's the other. That's the other thing. I know there was one more question. I don't know if you want me to address that now or maybe later. So it was about repression. Sorry.
Yeah, please go ahead. I think you can continue.
So I think this other form of repression, which is, deportations, for example, of Kashmiris from airports, or the passports. There's 100 journalists whose passports were confiscated, for example, last year by the state. So they're not allowed to travel. So it is like this open air prison, literally, that Kashmir has been turned to, because people are not sometimes let in, and there's some people who are not let out. And then that's certainly what's happening. There's a lot of people, a lot of academics, journalists who are either in situations of exile or self-exile, and then their families, of course. A lot of people I know whose families are now being harassed and troubled because their kids and their sons and daughters might be too, quote unquote, vocal outside of India. So there's all these things that are also happening to not just silence dissent within India, but also outside. So yes, for sure. That was the question, I think, that was in the chat. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much, Mona. And another question that is here, and I think like Joey, you already mentioned a little bit about continuing the work that JKCCS and APDP have been doing in like documenting the violations. Like you mentioned a little bit, like doing a research and like try to continue that work, because it's such an important work to call for accountability, documenting violations that is taking place. So maybe if I can direct this question to you first before moving on to Juliet to respond to that as well.
Yes, but of course you have to see it will be very tough to take on the task that JKCCS and APDP has left, especially at this point, where as I said, civil society is basically crippled, the whole of them, in the Kashmir area. But then, don't stop. We have disappeared Asia in terms of enforced disappearance cases. So I think the best way to answer it is if you see Indian cases of enforced disappearance, especially in Kashmir, in this database, because we will soon be making it public, then the answer would, yes, there is a degree of success still in documenting. But there's more to enforced disappearances. There's a whole lot of human rights violations, as I said. We're concerned with basic human rights, enforced disappearances, and basically civil society participation. That's how you keep democracy working, not just elections. And so the answer to the question whether there is success, I think there's some success, there's some point. But we cannot divulge how. I'm so sorry. It's not the right time. But yes, we keep on going. We try and make up for what JKCCS and APDP has left. But it's a very, very tough act to follow. There you have it, Benny.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Joey. I fully understand. I think then also link back to what has been mentioned, the importance of international advocacy and solidarity to continue push this, because the situation inside of in India has been so repressive. People are not so much vocal about it than we are who are based outside, having the moral responsibility to push more and more about this issue. And Julia, do you have any thoughts on this question and topic specifically?
Yes, thank you. And I want to mention this at the very beginning, but about the dearth of documentation about human rights violations since particularly since 2019, and even more so since 2021. And that's this challenge that we don't necessarily have all the answers when it comes to overcoming it. I want to also, I think it bears reminding here that international human rights organizations have not had access to Kashmir for a very long time, at least not as long as I can remember. And neither has the UN, and particularly the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. So the two reports that OHCHR published on the human rights situation in Kashmir in 2018 and 2019 were done remotely and with a lot of documentation from JKCCS and APDP and others. So it's very hard to, overestimate the impact that the current situation has on the ability of international organizations and the UN to continue documenting the situation in Kashmir. That's not to say that we're not doing it in some sense, we are doing it without giving too many details. Another big challenge that I want to remind here is also there's a very real threat of the erasure of what has been done by the authorities. And so preserving the past work of JKCCS and APDP is extremely important. Things are being taken offline. We saw it, very recently. There was an article published by the Caravan on torture, on incident of torture in Kashmir, and the Indian government forced the Caravan to take it offline, and other Indian-based media who tried to replicate it were also forced to shut it down. So, for instance, something very concrete that can be done from an international perspective is making sure to host this type of information, whether it's NGO reports, documentation, or media articles, in places that can't then be touched by the Indian government, so that this evidence, this proof of human rights violations are preserved. there's been, I think, also some questions in the Q&A about, practical things that can be done for Khurram, for other Kashmiri human rights defenders and political prisoners. And I think, again, helping amplify the messages, giving them visibility, I think is what's probably most needed at this stage. Something that is, I think, very much a tactic of the Indian government is to draw out these legal cases, because it's incredibly hard to maintain attention on a case when nothing happens for months and for months and for months. When you have a trial that's underway, you can get more visibility. You can ask people to monitor court hearings. You can give updates to people. But when nothing is happening, it's hard to maintain that visibility. And we need to fight back against that by doing things like this webinar, by sharing the information, by amplifying those messages on social media and with policymakers.
Okay, thank you so much, Juliet. I think, yeah, thank you to whoever asking this question, anonymous attendee, because this is also like the final question that I would like to ask to all the panelists, like Juliet has clearly already mentioned, and maybe I will move on to Joey, and then after that to Mona.
You're right. Break the silence. Break the silence. As of now, we know our limitations. We are not as powerful as these governments. They have power, they have control, but we have voices. You see, the other question, like in documentation, it's very important for us to organize the families of the disappeared in order to document the cases of enforced disappearances. And right now, the Association of Parents of Disappeared Persons in Kashmir is not operating because of the oppression. So you have a problem right there. But while they are not able to operate, they rely on us to keep the issue floating in whatever venue that we can raise this. Leaders of other nations would not want to talk about this. Mona has already said that. So let's keep on talking to them. Let's keep on raising these issues at the level of the United Nations. I remember when inside information was saying that when Khurram was arrested, and then there were so many reactions at the international level. So his captors was asking him, why are you getting so much fuss, so much reaction at the international level? See, that's the point. And the point is, we join hands together, we protect each other, human rights defenders, those who are concerned. We have to rely on ourselves basically at times like this. So let's try and break the silence. Let's keep on talking about these issues. Kashmir, Asia-wide, global. We just have to do it right. Thanks, Benny.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Joey. And over to you, Mona.
Yeah, I think, we've already heard precisely what needs to happen and what we're up against. I think it's a very clear sense of who needs to act and how we need to forge citizen coalitions, solidarity groups, align our struggles in ways that makes an impact. I mean, I'm thinking about what happened across campuses, for example, this past few months, and the kind of energy that young people brought to the issue in ways that was absolutely uplifting. For many, I remember talking with people who thinking about my own seemingly very hopeless, situation and recognizing that those student mobilizations was what was bringing us so much hope and so much courage in the face of adversity. And that's something I feel we do need to learn lessons from, is how do we come together in ways that reproduces and multiplies our strength and our initiatives, our resolve to keep fighting fascism, and to recognize that we are fighting fascist forms of government. I mean, I think to name the violence and to clearly spell out what we're up against, I think is of the first sort of victory, because sometimes we don't even know what we're up against. What is this? What is the nature of the beast that we're up against? I think recognizing that and recognizing, or trying to then figure out how do we strategize to really struggle or battle this beast is a huge thing. I mean, I don't want to bring it up as sort of this last thing, but when I talk about multi-front campaigns, one of the very early things Khurram and I discussed, for example, was Kashmir's very fragile ecology, right? That seems somewhat disconnected from the conversation, but is in fact deeply connected, because I feel people join hands for different reasons. They have different investments in causes. And some people think about ecology more, deeply than they do perhaps about the political context of certain things. But developing those, recognizing that environmental rights, right, are human rights too. And in a place like Kashmir, which is a settler colonial frontier for India, what that means for people, what that means for communities, how it's debilitating spaces and people, is another way to expand this kind of multi-front advocacy that we can then build on, envision, and operationalize. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Mona. And I think linking to what has been mentioned previously as well on like what we can do from outside, there's like a campaign that is currently going on calling for the defenders who are facing reprisals due to their engagement with the UN mechanisms. This is led by our partner organization as well, ICHR. And this is like the End Reprisals campaign, where all of us are trying to call out countries and also like the UN mechanisms to be more and more vocal, and not just simply, as Juliet mentioned, using like secondary sources to write a report on India, but trying to be a bit more proactive as well on what is happening to Khurram and the situation in Kashmir. With that, I will conclude our discussion today. Thank you so much to Mona, Juliet, and Joey for joining us, and to all the co-organizers. And yeah, 19 June is the birthday of Khurram. So on behalf of everyone, if I may, like to send our best wishes for Khurram to continue to be the kind man where everyone seek help from him wherever he is, whether he's at home, whether he's in Rohini jail at the moment. And hopefully we can celebrate the next birthday with Khurram joining us, and also Irfan. So thank you so much. Have a nice rest of the day, and also have a good evening if you're joining from Asia. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.